Good morning, Year 9, and welcome to your third lesson. Today we're going to be looking at Germany and the impact of World War One. Again, if you have any questions or you want to show me any work, please do email them to me, Mrs. Edwards, and I will get back to you with some feedback. So today we're going to have a look at the key events that happened around the First World War for Germany. And then we've looked this year at the First World War in Year 9 history, but we looked at the impact and the key changes the war had on Britain. But today we're going to have an overview looking at the impact and key changes the war had on Germany. So first of all, have a pause and see if you can answer these true or false questions based on the work we did last lesson. So Kaiser Wilhelm II was the great-grandfather of Queen Victoria, true or false? The SPD was the fastest growing political party in the Reichstag by 1913. Prussia was the largest state within Germany. Industrialisation increased the wealth of German workers and prosperity. 1891 laws were made to ensure children under the age of 13 could not be employed. So pause and have a go at those questions. Let's see how you did. So Wilhelm was not the great-grandfather of Queen Victoria. That's false. She in fact was his great-grandmother. The SPD was in fact the fastest growing political party. That is true. Prussia was the largest state in Germany. Again, true. Industrialisation increased the wealth of German workers and prosperity. False. For some, yes, but on the whole, no. It was mainly Germany itself that increased in wealth. A lot of workers and prosperity didn't increase to begin with. They were doing long working hours. Their living conditions weren't great, a bit like the Industrial Revolution in Britain. In 1831, laws were made to ensure children under 13 could not be employed. Again, this is true. Okay, so see if you got 5 out of 5. World War One. 1914 to 1918. We've looked this year at the main causes of World War One. So looking at the military, the rivalry between them, the race to build the most dreadnoughts, the race to have the biggest army. We looked at imperialism, so the jealousy of Britain's great empire and other countries trying to build upon their empire, particularly Germany. We looked at the alliance system, how that caused a threat to each other of the alliances, and we also looked at nationalism, pride in your country. We know that Germany declared war on Belgium. It invaded Belgium. It was hoping to sneak through Belgium, get to France and defeat France relatively quickly. However, as you can see on the newspapers in front, Great Britain declared war on Germany after it invaded Belgium, and Germany didn't expect this to happen. There was, if you remember, I always like to mention this fact, but the Treaty of London that was signed in the sort of early 1800s to protect Belgium if anyone was to go to war to keep their neutrality, Britain upheld that and decided to attack. And when war was greeted, it was quite enthusiastically greeted. Germany's army commanders and German people thought this is going to be a quick victory. We're a really great country, really powerful. We pride ourselves on our military. They expected it was going to go really well for them, as you know, did Britain. The problem for Germany, and what might be seen as a positive for Britain and France, was that Germany was here, as you can see. Part of its alliance was Austria-Hungary, which was right next to it, which kind of helped it. However, on one side here, we've got Russia, okay? And Russia was part of the alliance with France, just on the other side of Germany and the United Kingdom or Great Britain, okay? So Germany was fighting a war on two sides, which can be an awful lot trickier than if you're just focusing on one area. And obviously Belgium, they came through here to Ypres and get through to France that way. So on the west, they tried to advance into France, but that was halted. And as you know, there was the Great Western Front, which spanned for quite a few miles all the way through down here to the sea. Okay, and unfortunately, both France, Britain, and Germany struggled to advance across the Western Front. The trenches were dug. Between 1915 and 1917, Germany suffered around 3 million casualties and not very great advancements, but like you know, neither side really did. Over on the east, so over here where Russia is, the war actually went pretty well for Germany. Russia wasn't particularly a well-advanced country at this time. It was very slow. It was large, but the industry hadn't developed, and it was still quite a very poor country. So their men weren't as up to scratch as Germany's men were, because they'd been training a lot better. So they managed to have quite a lot of good victories, and in 1917 Russia actually surrendered and signed a peace treaty with Germany. They were undergoing a revolution themselves, and there was a communist revolution, a socialist revolution happening in Russia, where the royal family had been attacked, and therefore they needed to end the war so that they could sort out their political issues, which was obviously a good thing for Germany, because it meant that by 1917 they could end the war on the east, and they could just put all of their focus and advancements on trying to defeat the war on the west. So why was the defeat a surprise? Because for a lot of Germans, they actually thought that Germany was going to win, and they were doing really well. So as Russia left the war and America actually entered the war to help the Allies, German generals hoped that they could defeat France and Britain before the American troops arrived. So they thought, if we swoop in, focus on defeating France and Britain, do it all before America arrives, we'll have more of a chance of being successful. And so what happened is there was something known as the Spring Offensive, which is March 1918 in springtime, which is why it's called the Spring Offensive. And Germany decided to launch one last big attack, and this attack was actually really quite effective. And in some places across the front line, they'd actually advanced 40 miles, and the British and the French suffered really quite heavy casualties, and there was a lot of deaths and a lot of injuries. But Germany couldn't keep it up, so they launched this big attack, and it was great, but they couldn't keep it up. But obviously people back home in Germany would have seen Russia's been defeated, we've gained 40 miles, it's all looking really positive. So they thought, well, this is it, this is the turning point, we are going to win. All of the propaganda, all of the newspapers back at home in Germany were saying, we're really superior, we've got this, we are going to be defeating them, don't worry, there'll be a victory soon. But then in August, the Allies launched a major counterattack, and it became clear that Germany is actually going to be defeated. And it got to the point where a lot of German generals knew that they were going to be defeated, but they'd never admit that they were going to be defeated to other Germans. And in September, German generals explained to a really shocked Kaiser Wilhelm that they're not going to win, and they're going to have a ceasefire. And obviously the Kaiser, being a really effective leader, decided that he was going to flee. He was going to leave. He was going to quit being the Kaiser of Germany, and on the 11th of November fled to Holland. So the news of the country's surrender came as quite a bit of a shock, because the newspapers had always focused on the stories of German success during the war and never on any of their failures. The Allies had never invaded Germany, and they felt that if the country had been invaded, then that is a failure. That means that you're probably going to lose. But the fact that Germany was never invaded at all, they couldn't understand how they lost. So there was an awful lot of shock, and people started to take it out on politicians and saying that those politicians that took control of the country after Kaiser Wilhelm fled, they were known as November criminals, and they were the ones that were kind of stopping the war from happening. So using that information, can you have a go at that question that I've just put at the bottom? So in your own words, explain why the defeat was a surprise and why some people might have been quite angry. So pause now and just have a go at writing an answer to that in your box. So some key facts about the war. The German army was made up of conscripts, so they were forced to join. So you had to join the war for a certain period of time when you were of age in Germany, which is obviously very different to Britain, because in Britain we know that they had to try and get people to volunteer, but it meant that they had quite a large army. It was led by traditional leaders from the upper classes, so particularly Prussians, those militaristic generals. And throughout the war, the information coming home was really patchy, and ordinary Germans couldn't understand why there was food shortages, because The newspapers were saying, we've done this, we've done that, it's really positive, and yet people in Germany go, well, why have we got no food? Why have we got rationing? What's going on? And rationing was introduced in 1915, and that's when people began to protest. And there were actually food riots in 1916 because it's quite early on in the war. There wasn't enough food and people couldn't understand why. There was also some leaders of a group known as the Spartacists, and we're going to look at these people particularly in a bit more detail next week. And they were Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and they held a demonstration against the war on the 1st of May in 1916. They were arrested, and in response to this, workers rose up for their first strike of the war. People started to realise that, this isn't right. They weren't happy. There was a lot of unrest. People are hungry. They're upset. People are dying in the war, and they want answers, and they didn't feel they were getting them, which is why they started to resort to these strikes. And Liebknecht and Luxemburg actually although they were arrested, they come back and they start another strike after the war, which we'll look at next week. There was also something known as the Navy blockade by Britain, and that was really, really successful. As you know, from what I said last week, Germany had a great industry, but the problem was their agriculture wasn't great, so they weren't producing enough food for their country. They relied on having to get imports from lots of other countries. And when the British Navy blocked this, that's why there was lots of food shortages in Germany. And in 1916 to 1917, we have what's known as the turnip winter, which is where basically the diet of many Germans was turnips, okay, because that was the traditional food for livestock. That was the most staple. That was the most thing that they could get. Female mortality rates rose from 11.5% all the way through to 30%. So female deaths were increasing on the home front. Malnutrition meant that people could not stave off the influenza virus. You might have heard quite a lot recently in the news talking about the Spanish flu that came in 1918 and sort of that 1916 to 1918 time period. And it did come, and it hit Germany really quite heavily because people had not been eating very well in the war. They were malnourished. They didn't have the strength to fight off the flu, and from what they should have survived. A lot of them should have survived the Spanish flu, but because of their poor health, it meant that a lot of them died from it. There were huge losses on the battlefield. The failure of the Ludendorff offensive and Germans entering the war meant that it was nearly impossible for Germany to win. As much as they wanted to, it wasn't going to happen. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to copy out this table in your books, okay? And as we go through the slides that we've just watched and the slides following on, I want you to try and fill this in. And next week, I'm going to go through this. So next week, there'll be a completed table for you to check how you've done, okay? But before the war, Germany had a strong monarchy, so it had a really, strong Kaiser Wilhelm, and it relied on that. The country seemed quite settled. Most Germans supported the war and were happy for the war to go ahead. They were excited. The economy was growing and German factories were producing lots of goods, and the living conditions and wages were also improving. So as we go through, can you fill in how these things changed during the war? So there were money problems. There were lots of changes in the economy. So factories started to produce weapons and war supplies rather than goods. So therefore, they'd been focusing so much on the war effort that everyday things for people were being pushed to the wayside. Lots of workers are also signed up to fight. So that meant there was some workers that weren't working in the factories as well, particularly those that might know what they were doing quite well. By 1918, the industry was only producing 2/3 of what it had in 1913. Money was running out, and the government really struggled to support families who lost men at war. So usually they'd give some money to the widowers of the war, but they struggled because they didn't have that. And if you remember from last week, the government had spent so much money on building its navy and building its industry before the war that it was in a lot of debt in 1914, and that obviously that debt was just being added to throughout the war. The next thing is something called war weariness. So the British Navy blockaded, so they blocked and they cut off German ports so they couldn't get their supplies from other countries. There was food and fuel shortages, which we know as the turnip winter in 1916-1917. People got really upset with the food shortages. Obviously, I've mentioned this a lot in my lessons before, but I can get quite hangry. If I'm quite hungry, I get quite frustrated and angry. And supporters of Social Democrats started to turn against the war. And particularly by 1917, there was lots of anti-war groups forming, formed an independent political party because they were so upset. They wanted these changes and they wanted to try and influence the government a little bit more. There were also quite a lot of strikes during the war, so wages were kept really low during the war, but factory owners were profiting, and a lot of workers couldn't understand that, why they couldn't have more of a wage to help them, feed their families, but the factory owners who were profiting loads, but they weren't increasing their wage. So there was a lot of resentment and anger between the rich and the poor. In January 1918, there was loads of strikes organised demanding peace negotiations and asking the government to take some peaceful negotiations because Germany just couldn't sustain it anymore. They just couldn't cope with the war. In October, the end of October 1918, there was also a mutiny at Kiel. So sailors refused to follow their orders because the German Navy refused to sail from Kiel to attack the British blockade because they knew that what was going to happen was they were probably going to lose. They knew there was no hope for them, so they refused to do it. They stood their ground. Eventually, the government had to send soldiers to force the sailors to actually join the protest to stop this, but they ended up joining the protest, and soon towns were being overtaken by these special soldier councils because the soldiers were going, actually, yeah, this isn't right, we need to stop, we need this war to end. And then between the 9th, 10th and 11th, we start to see the Kaiser leave. So he officially resigns on the 9th of November and he's left the country by the 11th of November in 1918. Another way to get peace to end Germany was the Kaiser had to relinquish some of his power. America said that the Kaiser had to relinquish some of his power if he wanted peace, and he couldn't accept that, which is one of the reasons why he fled and went to Holland. Germany then became a republic, so it didn't have a monarchy anymore like we do. And a new government was formed, which we're going to look at next week. And Friedrich Ebert was elected leader of Germany, and he was leader of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. So we're going to look at the influence and the changes that came about for that next week. So pause now and go back if you need to, but have a go at filling in this table using all of that information. And have a go at this question. So you can just put the 4 colours that I've got here. If you want, you could just put them as little mind maps or as a little table and see if you can fill in where each of these facts belong. So in what ways were the lives of German people affected in the First World War? So this is kind of an exam question, but this is just to make it easier. So I'm not asking you to answer the question, I'm just asking you to put these squares into the right category. So can you put the examples in the right category? See how you did. So family life was affected because the war left 60,000 war widows and 2 million children without their fathers. German workers had restrictions placed on their wages, and there was lots of divisions in society, particularly because obviously the workers weren't getting paid as much, and they noticed their standard of living dropping considerably. Health was affected an awful lot because in 1918 Germans were surviving on turnips and bread. A lot of people were being killed by the deadly flu. Also because of fuel shortages, it meant that people couldn't heat their homes up very well. And the naval blockades led to terrible shortages of food, medicines and clothing. Family life. Work also was a problem. German workers had restrictions placed on their wages. Women had worked in factories during the war, and some factory owners had made a fortune during the war. And then political changes. Demonstrations were held against throughout the war against the Kaiser and the government. Many ex-soldiers and civilians felt Germany could have won the war, and they felt betrayed by politicians. So I will leave you with these 5 questions. Have a go and then check them in your fact book after, and if you've got any questions about today's lessons, please drop me an email and let me know. So have a go at these 5 plenary questions and then check them in your fact book, and I will see you next week to have a look at what happened in Germany after the First World War. Thank you very much, Year 9. Take care. Bye.